I think 1979-80 was a year of tremendous drought. It was very, very dry. The drought index by, well, I think in November was something in the 170s, 180s, which is it's extremely high. I don't think if it ever gets to 200, it's still 200, I think, is the measure. That's when birds drop out of the sky dead and the trees fall over dead. But it takes a long time to get much higher. So that, and later in 1983, was also a year of great drought, which has an impact on fire behaviour. And this is something you need to be aware of, that it's not always going to do what you think it's going to do in a normal year. So 1980, nothing much through the year that I can remember, but in November, and this was, Engadine were turned out to a fire at, it was the National Falls car park in the Royal National Park. Waterfall Nev Nicholson was the captain, and he'd received a fire call from a passing resident and hadn't actually told anybody, unfortunately, and they'd turned out by themselves. Luckily, Brian Parry heard him calling, because we were able to turn the rest of the brigades out, and it was, in those times, it was called the Central Zone, and that was Waterfall, Heathcote, Engadine and Loftus, and we were sent to this fire with those four brigades. And it was a long, hard fight to running fairly long hose lays, mostly 25mm hose, because the water was a long way away. We had tankers, I think Engadine 8.2 by that stage, or was it 6.2? It might have been 6.2, I think, was carrying water for us from the upper causeway. That was the only place there was any water, and it was a real long trip around. Anyway, Loftus and Engadine worked one side, Heathcote and Waterfall worked the other. But the fire just went on and on and on. It wasn't all that big, it wasn't all that hot a day. It was quite a mild day. But we just couldn't put it out, and that was part of the fact it was so dry. The fuel was dry, and it was just a real effort to try and put it out. At some stage, I'm not sure, probably about midday, because we turned out in the morning. It was dark when we turned out. They decided that we're probably wasting our time, and that the attack was probably going to be better from Ulula Track. And so they pulled out everybody except for the two Engadine tankers. We were left to try and do what we could. And off it went, and I don't remember anything happening out of the ordinary. I know a very strong wind came through, and it was a wind from the southeast, which normally you wouldn't be worrying about, although the night of the 1968 fire was a southeasterly wind that pushed the fire across. So they certainly can come from the southeast, and that's probably another lesson, that whilst we're predominantly going to get west nor'westers, stranger things can happen. You obviously know what a southerly will do, and a sou'easter can do, easterly winds can be just as nasty. But I know we were there, we were working away, and we didn't know, oblivious to what had happened. We just did not know. But just what had happened while we were doing that, they were putting a fight in on the Ulula Track, and at one stage, once this wind came through, Brian called for every unit to make themselves safe, and there were a number of them to the east, and they just stayed where they were because the fire was going to go past them. Unfortunately, HQ81 with a crew of 5, they tried to get to Waterfall Oval, and they didn't make it. The fire was coming out, and again, it wasn't a hot fire. It was a fire burning through, there was a lot of Hackia, a lot of Banksia, and it was burning so fast, and it was a very dark, very black smoke. It was creating a lot of carbon monoxide, which is again very unusual in a bushfire. You don't usually get enough carbon monoxide to give yourself a mild headache. But apparently on the tankers that were further up the track, the pumps started to labour. They could not get enough oxygen, and some of the crews fell unconscious to the ground. They were just out to it because of this of the gases, and I think that's what overcame the Waterfall crew, the HQ81 crew. They pulled up at the worst place they could have. They pulled up next to a rock face. They couldn't see it in all the dust, smoke, and they got alongside the truck, and that's where they met their end. There was a National Parks vehicle not that far away from them, that was parked just further down the road, and the worst damage it got was a melted flasher. So talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And just another thing from a personal point of view, my wife was at the control centre again, and they weren't told which tanker had been lost, and they were marking them off as they called in. And she got to the bottom of the list, and the only two trucks left on the list were Engadine 8.1 and Engadine 6.2, so she thought, here we go again. Am I a widow today or not? Because she thought one of those trucks had been lost. But as it was, when the wind came through, the fire went berserk at the other end. We lost all our hose line, and I got quite cranky and raced up to the truck and called the control centre to see if we were going to get any help, not knowing what had happened. And then she heard my voice and grabbed the person next to her and nearly broke their hand. So she liked me much better in those days. So, but yeah, it was not just difficult for the firefighters, but for the people who can hear it all happening, and for the relatives. It's very hard for them, and that's what people have got to think of, is to try and put them at ease to some degree if you can. It's always going to be dangerous. You can't always guarantee it, but again, be thoughtful and don't be too cavalier with people's feelings. Yeah, and that's Alan Hemmett turned up at National Falls, and he's in his old, I think he was still in his old Jeep. He had a left-hand drive ex-army Jeep in the Second World War, and he had Marty Keeler with him, and then he told us the news, and because most of that crew had known the HQ headquarters crew very well, they thought, no, it's time to take you boys home. Because I remember just that earlier that day, I was standing below it, and Steve Trunkhorn was above me on a rock, and we were telling jokes, and that was my last. But it was a happy memory of him.